All right, in our last video on the institution of the family, we're going to think about some problems facing contemporary families, particularly low income and families of color. Part of what we want to think about when we think about institutions is what are the laws and policies around families today? In the US, for example, um, we mentioned the rise of two-income households. And part of what this does is it creates a situation in which every household is dependent on two income earners. Um, that means that if one person loses a job, which in our increasingly fragile economy is very likely, um, then the household is actually more fragile. While you have two incomes, you are also dependent on two incomes, not just one. Another key issue in our society is there's very little paid family leave, meaning that if you want to have a child, you essentially have to make a choice between having a child and having a job. Um, this issue in particular faces poorer families more because they have to, even if they take a few months off of work, um, A, that creates a greater burden for them, and B, they can't pay for someone to come take care of their children um, once they go back to work. This is one of the reasons we see more extended families or aunts, uncles, grandparents um, being central in poor communities. In addition to restricted access to childcare, this also means that in poor families we see a trend of what's called adultification. This means that as children grow older, they are more quickly allowed to or made to take up adult responsibilities. Um, Cooking, cleaning, and caring for siblings, often because parents are at work. Uh, so this creates different dynamics, particularly in poor families and families of color. Now, if you follow any of the debates we see today, many of the issues are intensified by both parents actually having to be at home or by the issues of trying to isolate from the family during a pandemic. That's one of the things we'll think about when we have our class discussion this week. Often low-wage labor and poverty um, disproportionately affect women of color and poorer families. Um, Kamala Harris, the current vice presidential pick for the Democratic Party, um, one of the knocks against her was that she actually would have mothers arrested who had their children who weren't in school or truant children, because it's the responsibility of the parents to make sure their children go to school. Um, but of course, if you're working, then you can't always keep track of where your children are. And so this creates a lot of stereotypes about the collapse of the family in communities of color. And we do indeed see in both black and less educated households that there are higher single parent numbers. Over half of black households are single parent. What was the trend here? Why does this happen? Um, Many people fall back on certain cultural, what we call cultural racist stereotypes. Irresponsibility, um, not caring about the institution, being too lax or loose. But these are actually problematic and racist stereotypes. Up through the 1960s, most African American families had a mother and father in the household. As we read in Stephanie Kuntz, there are more extended kin families in African American communities. But we do see a clear rise over time in the rise of single mother households. This takes place in the context of an overall decline in marriage. So again, we need to be careful about what we lay at the feet of the African American community because less women are getting married and um, less women are having children overall. But what can account for the rise of this single parent household? Well, as with other things, it's a complex set of conditions. One is that it's seen as more okay for women to be single parents. But We also see greater poverty in the African American community and long-term poverty. This means that people have to move around more for work. This is typical of all poorer families. So this is true in Latinx families as well, that um, where you can get work is where you go. This means that if a family wants to stay in place, often that means the man might have to leave or the mother might have to move. And if the two parents find work in different places, that means they have to be in different places. Crucially, we also see the rise of the prison industrial complex. This exacerbates the economic situation, makes it worse. 1 in 3 black men will go into the prison system and come out with a felon status. That makes that ability of finding work much more difficult. But also, we are simply incarcerating and locking up more men. So if we say, why aren't there more men in the household? We need to ask, where are they? It's not just a question of irresponsibility, though there are irresponsible people, and we might be able to come up with examples of that. We don't explain a whole structure that way, a whole change in our society. In fact, Stephanie Kuntz's work shows that in households where the father doesn't live in the house, um, black fathers tend to be much more attentive and involved in their children's lives than white fathers in the same condition. So poor families face a lot of pressures, and we'll think about those and how those are exacerbated by pandemic conditions in our class this week.